Should you fertilize? That's the topic in this program. And I'm going to look at a number of different situations, including your lawn, your vegetable garden, houseplants, containers, raised beds, and your ornamental beds, and trees and shrubs. Let's not leave those out. Should you fertilize these things? For some reason, in the last couple of weeks, every place I go and everyone I talk to, fertilizer comes up. I guess because it's spring and people feel the need to fertilize. Now, it's interesting that some people never fertilize. So I was talking to a lady the other day and, her orchid's doing all right, but it's not doing great. And I asked her, well, how often do you fertilize? Oh, never. How do you expect the plant to grow if it doesn't get nutrients? And then on my Facebook group, Garden Fundamentals, we've been discussing whether or not you should water before you fertilize or after you fertilize. In other areas on social media, everyone's talking about how much fertilizer, which kind of fertilizer, when should you fertilize? And then, of course, the discussion comes up, should you use synthetic or organic? I see a lot of myths about synthetic. Things like, well, if you use synthetic, you'll burn your plant. Well, I have news for you. Organic will also burn your plant. The source of the nutrients doesn't matter. It's how much you put on. If you put on too much fertilizer of any type, it will burn your plant. You put on the right amount of organic or synthetic, it won't. It's as simple as that. One thing I'm going to do in this video is save you a lot of money and time. Not only that, but you're going to be kinder to the environment. If for no other reason, watch this program so you are better able to take care of the environment. So what is the problem here? Well, it kind of stems from the idea that everybody's fertilizing and you feel obligated to fertilize too. You maybe don't know why you're doing it, although you know nutrients are important for plants. You may not know which nutrients to add, which NPK do you really need, and which one to use for various parts of the garden or your house plants. But everybody tells you to fertilize. All the books on gardening, all the online information. And boy, those advertisers, they're telling you to fertilize. Go to the local grocery store or hardware store and the bags of fertilizer are 10 feet high and everyone's grabbing them, putting them in their trunk of their car and driving home to fertilize. You don't want to be left out, do you? So you buy some bags too and you go home and fertilize. That's the wrong way to approach this topic. If you're not sure if you need to fertilize, it's because you don't understand enough about how fertilizer and soil interact with plants. Once you understand that, all these questions about fertilizer are really easy to answer. Should you fertilize? Well, it comes down to three important things. Your soil is critical. What kind of soil are we talking about? What kind of plants are we talking about? Now, in most cases, the type of plant is not important. My advice will work for almost any kind of plant, but of course there are a few exceptions. But the plant is not. And the third factor is the actual growing condition. Are we trying to grow a tropical plant in a small pot? Do we have acres of soil and a plant can spread out and you actually have real soil? Remember, the things in pots are generally not soil. That's potting media. There's no soil in there. Many of you have containers with no soil. A lot of you even make raised beds with no soil, although I don't recommend that. If you want to learn more about that, watch my video about the best soil for raised beds. But in the ground, we have real soil. That's different than potting media. Now, should you fertilize? Well, this really depends on three key factors. One is your soil. What kind of soil do you have? Is it potting media in a container? If you're working with raised beds, do you have real soil in there? Or is it artificial potting media? A lot of you are using the artificial material, and that has to be fertilized differently than if you have real soil. Now, I recommend using real soil, and if you're not familiar with my recommendation there, watch my video on the best soil for raised beds. The second criteria is the type of plant. Now, this isn't as important as many of you think. Almost every plant can be treated the same way. Now, your goals for that plant might differ a little. So house plants, we just grow them nice and slow, that's fine. Tomatoes outside in the garden, we want to grow fast so we get a harvest, particularly if you're in a cold climate. But for the most part, you can ignore the actual type of plant. The third factor is the actual environment where you're growing. Is it a tiny pot? Is it a larger container? Is it a large raised bed? Or do you have acres of soil to worry about? That also affects whether or not you should fertilize. Now let's look at some of the basics of fertilizer. What fertilizer does is provide the nutrients that plants need. We go around talking about feeding plants, but that's a myth. We don't feed plants. Plants will take the nutrients from the soil around their root and use it as they need it. Our job is to make sure that that soil has the nutrients that plants might need. And then plants figure out what to take up and how much to take up. So we're not feeding plants, we're actually feeding soil, if you think about it. Our job as gardeners is to make sure the nutrients plants need are in the soil. And here I'm using soil to also mean potting media. Now, what if your soil already has all the nutrients that plants need? Well, then you don't need to fertilize. Okay? We're only fertilizing to replace the missing nutrients. If your soil has lots of phosphate, we don't want to add any more. If your soil is low in nitrogen, which is very common, we want to add some nitrogen. Our job is to add the nutrients that are missing in soil. We don't feed plants. If you remember nothing else from this video, remember that, and it'll make you a much better gardener. The other thing that's important is that nutrients make plants grow. If we supply more nutrients, they grow better. We know that from farming, right? Farmers use fertilizer to make plants grow so they get a good harvest. Sometimes that's important in gardening. In my vegetable garden, I'm in zone 5 and it's cold here most of the year. We have a short growing season. I got to grow things fast so I get a harvest before fall. So I need to have those plants grow fast. But my house plants, they can grow slow. It doesn't matter to me. The cedar growing outside my house, I don't want it to grow fast. In fact, I actually prefer it to stay the size it is. It's a perfect size. And in a couple of years, it's going to be too big. So the rate at which we want our plants to grow also affects whether or not we should be fertilizing. All right, now let's look at some specific situations in the garden and ask the question, should we fertilize? The first one I'd like to look at is really sandy soil. Now, I'm not talking about sandy loam here. I'm talking about really sandy soil. So down in Florida, there are areas where you're basically growing on the beach. The same is true in Ontario. A couple hours drive north of where I am, there's some areas that are extremely sandy. There's almost no organic matter in that soil and no clay or silt. It's just beach sand. Sand does not hold on to nutrients. So if we fertilize sand, it just runs right through. So sandy soil has very little nutrients and we have to supply everything. We can pretty much assume that there's not much there and we have to supply it all. Now, most of you don't have that kind of soil. Most of you have some combination of sand, silt, and clay, and then the story changes. So for the rest of this talk, assume that we're talking about that kind of soil. How about your herbaceous beds? These are the flower beds where you have your perennials or your tulip. The hostas are growing there. Should you fertilize those? Well, the answer is probably not. If you have half-decent soil, it's got all the nutrients the plants need, and you don't have to add any more. So how do you know if they have enough nutrients? Well, first of all, you look at your plants, and if they're grown reasonably well, they have enough nutrients. They're not missing anything. If they're missing some nutrients, you're going to see it on the plant growth. You're going to see it on the leaf. If you have problems growing those kind of plants, then have your soil tested, find out what's missing, and then add the missing item. Don't just go to the store and buy a 10-10-10 fertilizer and throw it around and hope that solves the problem. That's not good for the environment. It's not good for your pocketbook. It's just a waste of resources. But for most of you, you won't need to fertilize. My garden is a 6-acre garden, and I have over an acre of beds around the house, and most of those are herbaceous type plants, all those perennials that you know. And a lot you don't know. I don't fertilize when I plant, and I don't fertilize 20 years later. I don't need to fertilize. My soil has the nutrients plants need. I do mulch with wood chips, and that adds a little bit of nutrients as they decompose. I also keep all the organic matter in the garden. So when I'm cutting branches or I deadhead something, I just throw it on the ground and let it decompose. Most of you are in the same situation, and you don't need to fertilize. There you go. I just saved you a bunch of money and time. How about trees and shrubs? Well, trees and shrubs are plants that we don't want to grow very fast. Now, maybe in the first couple of years, you wish they grew a little faster so they look like something. But once they reach some sort of mature stage, We want them to slow down in growth. Now, in either situation, whether they're young or old, trees and shrubs don't need to be fertilized, or rarely. Again, if you have a nutrient deficiency, we're going to add the nutrients that are missing, but in general, let them fend for themselves. They'll make big root systems and they'll find the nutrients they want. Trees and shrubs rarely need to be fertilized. What about your lawn? Do you need to fertilize it? Well, that really depends on your goals and the type of grass you have. My comments here are for cool growing grasses. If you want that nice, lush, green grass, you're probably going to have to fertilize. A lot of people recommend fertilizing twice a year, once in spring and once in early fall or even late summer. If you're only going to do one of those, it's better to do the one in fall. Use a high nitrogen fertilizer, low in phosphate, which is the middle number. But if you're not that fussy about your lawn, you may not need to fertilize at all. For the first 20 years of my gardening experience, I never fertilized the lawn. I had a pretty good looking lawn. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it grew just fine, and I was happy with what I had. It didn't need to be fertilized. And if I didn't fertilize it, I had to cut it a lot less, which I did appreciate. Now, the problem with not fertilizing a lawn is that the growth is kind of skimpy. So it's thin, and that allows weeds to come in. And weeds start growing in between the grass blades. So some people say, well, to keep the weeds out, grow better grass. And that works. But to grow better grass, you have to fertilize more. When I was younger, I never fertilized the lawn, but I did spot spray the weeds. Back then, we were allowed to use herbicides for lawns, and once a year I would get that out and just spot spray the big weed. I didn't go through the lawn and spray it once a month like so many people did. And then in Ontario, we got to a point about 20 years ago where we banned that kind of herbicide. What happened? Well, the weeds started growing. What do you expect? So now I had a problem where I couldn't use the herbicide. I didn't want all the weeds, so I had to start fertilizing. Now, if you're just spot spraying, you're using very little herbicide. A bottle of that would last me 10 years. Now I go out and buy a couple bags of fertilizer every year. I'm not sure that that's better for the environment. Those big bags of fertilizer still have to be manufactured, and then they're shipped all over the country. Then I have to drive down to go and get them, and I do that every year. Is that better than buying one bottle every 10 years? I don't know, but I suspect the herbicide is actually less damaging to the environment. Now, if you don't care about the weeds and you just want something green on the ground, well, then you don't have to fertilize at all. How about your vegetable garden? Well, this is a little different. As we mentioned, here we want to grow things quickly. We want a high yield. We want good tasting tomatoes. So fertilizing is a little more important there. Ideally, you should know what's missing in your soil before you add any fertilizer. Now, what I recommend most people do is simply add some compost. Compost is an organic fertilizer that slowly releases nutrients over a long period of time, but it also has the benefit of improving the soil structure. It makes the soil better, so every year you're going to have better crop than the year before. And it takes care of all those micronutrients, so it's a simple solution. Add a couple inches of compost to your garden every year, and that's probably all you need. Now, the other thing that you may need is a little nitrogen. Okay, nitrogen is always low in all soils. It's keeping plants from growing better. So a little extra nitrogen can help. But other than that, you don't need to add anything else. How about raised beds? Well, with raised beds, it really depends on how you built them. What did you use to fill them? If you use soil, you probably also put in some compost. That means you don't have to fertilize. They're just like your vegetable garden. They have lots of nutrients. In fact, most of you are putting in too much compost into those raised beds. So you might have the opposite problem. Too many nutrients, particularly phosphate. If you made your raised beds with artificial material, perlite, composted wood, coir. Except for the compost, those things don't hold nutrients. Okay, peat moss has almost no nutrients in it. Perlite and vermiculite, no nutrients. So now you have an artificial potting media, and that may need to be fertilized. Again, it really depends on how much compost you put in. So for instance, if you started with triple mix, which is 1/3 peat moss, 1/3 soil, and 1/3 compost, you've got lots of compost. You don't have to fertilize those. Again, it depends what you started with. A lot of you are going out and buying potting media and putting it in there. Potting media doesn't have any nutrients. And the containers you have outside with potting media can be treated just like houseplant because houseplants are growing in a pot, which is just a small container. And in there, we have potting media. So things growing in potting media need to be fertilized. You can assume that there's no nutrients in there, and we want to fertilize all the time. And ideally, you're going to fertilize every time you water. If you're talking about containers outside in the middle of summer and you're watering every day, well, you might fertilize twice a week and then water the other times. But houseplants indoors, I water them with fertilizer solution every time I water them. Now, I don't have huge amounts of fertilizer in there. In fact, the ideal fertilizer for houseplants and anything in containers is a NPK ratio of 3:1:2, and the nitrogen level should be 100 parts per million. You can come to my blog, gardenmyths.com, and I have a blog posting that'll tell you how to calculate 100 parts per million. That's what I use. I make up the solution, and I water everything with it. Seedlings, mature plants, tomato seedlings I'm growing indoors, my streptocarpus plants, my orchids, they all get the same thing. The reason is that pretty much all plants need about the same nutrients. They need an NPK ratio 3:1:2, and they need nitrogen at about 100, 150 parts per million. Now, I recommend 100 because that way you're sure that you're not going to burn your plant. If you're a professional grower, you'll actually go up to 200 parts per million and maybe even 250 to really make those plants grow fast. But as home gardeners, we don't want that. We're better off staying around 100, 120. If you follow my advice, most of you are not going to need to fertilize. Maybe a little bit in your vegetable garden. But if you've added lots of compost into that vegetable garden, I wouldn't even fertilize. The compost is doing that for you. The compost is the fertilizer. So you don't have to add anything extra. Now let's look at a couple of very common fertilizer myths. Now I thought we squashed these years ago, but they keep popping up. Social media is great for making myths perpetuate forever. One of the most common ones has to deal with bloom boosters. These are special fertilizers to make things bloom more. And as gardeners, we all want more flowers. I got news for you. Bloom boosters don't work. Bloom boosters generally have a higher middle number, more phosphorus. Some of them also have higher potassium level. But it's the phosphorus that most people are after. And there's this myth out there that if we provide more phosphorus, plants grow and flower better. Simply not true. Plants need a certain level of phosphorus. And once they have that, adding more does nothing to increase bloom. In fact, if you add too much more, the plant will stop growing properly. Bloom boosters don't work. Forget about them. The second one has to do with tomatoes. Tomatoes seem to have a lot of myths around them, and maybe it's because most of us grow tomatoes. It's the most popular vegetable that gardeners grow. Tomatoes get a condition called blossom end rot, where the tip of the tomato goes black, gets kind of corky. Now, you can still eat those tomatoes. There's nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't look very good. And you don't eat the corky part. For years, we thought that this was a calcium deficiency. And so people recommended adding calcium to the soil. And I've seen all kinds of dumb ideas. Tums, for instance. Well, I calculated out that you would need to add 80 tums per plant to make any difference. How about banana peels, high in phosphate? Well, true, but they take a couple years to decompose, so they're not going to do anything this year. For some strange reason, people want to use Epsom salts on tomatoes. I don't get this because Epsom salts has no calcium in it. It's a magnesium sulfate. It says that right on the bag. And yet people put that in to stop blossom end rot. In fact, if you're thinking of using magnesium sulfate for fertilizer, forget it. Almost nobody, at least in North America, needs more magnesium in the soil. So back to tomatoes. It turns out that it's not a calcium deficiency in the soil usually, but there is a calcium deficiency in the fruit. There isn't enough calcium getting to the fruit, and the cause of that is infrequent watering. If you water more regularly, if you mulch to keep the soil moist all the time, you don't get blossom end rot. In very rare conditions, your soil might be deficient in calcium, and so adding some will help, but that's very rare. In most cases, it's a watering issue. If you'd like to learn more about fertilizers and soil, I'm going to put a couple of my most popular videos right here. Happy gardening.